Lekutei Sichos Chelek Yutes Vayelech Dalid Linismis Rabbi Yosef Binyamin Ben Rabbi Nasha Kaltman. Today's Sikha is on the topic of Hakhel, which is taught in Parshas Vayelech. And it's a Rashi Sikha, where we're going to focus on the details that the Rashi chooses to include in his Pirush, in his commentary on the Chumash, and why the various other details that are mentioned in the Gemara and in the Mishnah are omitted from this Rashi. And it's going to boil down to those details that are relevant in Pshutei Shel Mikra, Rashi brings, and those that aren't, Rashi does not bring. And we're going to see how each and every detail that Rashi does bring is precise and helps us understand the pasuk exactly. So let's begin. The first paragraph is a sort of introduction to the Sikha. When it gets to mitzvahs Hakhel, state in der Mishnah and in Gemara, with regard to the mitzvahs Hakhel, the Mishnah and the Gemara state kama pratim, various details. Rashi aber b'parsha seinu. However, Rashi in our parsha zokt nor pratim achadim binyan zeh only brings a select few details on this topic. Was von dem kann man wissen, welche pratim seinen muchrig bei Hakhel lefi pshutei shel mikra. And based on that, we're going to know which of these details are necessary by Hakhel according to pshutei shel mikra and which aren't. So let's go back to the beginning. Rashi stellt sich auf die Wörter tikra es ha-Torah hazos. Rashi is quoting the words, you should read this Torah, which is from the Parshas Vayelech, Vayikol Yisrael, Lerois es pnei Hashem alekecha, when all the Yidden will come to see the face of Hashem, B'makom asher yivchar, in the place that the Eibusher will choose, Tikra es ha-Torah hazos, you should read this Torah, neged kol Yisrael, to all of the Yidden, be'ozneihem, in their ears. So Rashi quotes these words when it's mefarish, and Rashi says like this: HaMelech hayaker, the king would read, Mitchilas eile hadvarim, from the beginning of Chumash Dvarim, K'diisiv Masechta Seita, as it is spelled out in the Gemara in Mishnayos Masechta Seita, Al bimo shel eitz, on a wooden platform, Shahaya Eisen ba'azara, that they would build in the Azara. Die pratim was Rashi sagt. Steht in the Mishnah Masechta Seita. These details are also mentioned in the Mishnah Masechta Seita. Aber in der Mishnah stehen noch kama pratim, was Rashi bringt nicht herab. The Mishnah has more details that Rashi does not mention. How the Torah was passed to the king. Welche Parshias bifrat had geleint, which specific Parshias the king read. The brachis was der Melech had gesagt nach der Kriyas HaTorah. The brachis, the blessings that the king gave after he finished reading the Torah. These are all examples of things that are mentioned in the Mishnah that Rashi and Chumash does not mention. Und der Tam is bepashtos. And the reason why Rashi does not mention these details is understood very simply. Rashi's role in his commentary on Torah is to translate and explain the verses, the psukim. And not to bring down the various different details of the mitzvahs. So therefore Rashi brings certain details and not others. However, is nit move on, but still not understood. In other words, the idea that Rashi will only bring some details and not others makes sense to us, because Rashi is only going to bring those details that are relevant to the psukim. But what we don't understand is why does Rashi mention these details that he does mention? Number one, what's the proof in Pshutei Shel Mikra to these details? Where do you see that the king would read? Where do you see that he read from Chumash Dvarim? Where do you see that there was a bima shel eitz, there was a wooden platform, etc., etc.? Beis says that in Eichnit Negeya to Havana Pshutei Shel Mikra. How do these details help us understand the psukim? In other words, when there's a question in the pasuk, Rashi brings in certain details that help us answer that question. What's missing in the pasuk? What don't we understand that Rashi needs to bring these details, and how do they answer these questions? So the beginning of Rashi that Rebbe is going to say now is not so problematic. It's understood. It's the second half that we're going to have an issue with. The erste Chelek from Pirush Rashi, Hamelech haya kerem et chilasei la'advarim. The first part of Rashi that the king would read from the beginning of Chumash Dvarim is verstandig, is understood why Rashi brings it. Number one, das ist der Abteich von die Werte, welche seine gesagt geworden, li Yeshua, und zu Zikne Yisrael, tikra satera azes. Earlier, the pasuk indicates that Moshe Rabbeinu is speaking to Yeshua and to the elders of the Jewish people. And what does he say? He says, tikra satera azes. So Rashi's first line is going to be a translation and an explanation of this word, of this line. Aleph tikra lashon yachid. The fact that it says you should read in the singular form. Der zu wem men sagt gleich nach dem Hakhel lashon yachid. So who is this individual to whom we are speaking? It's the same individual to whom we're going to say in the next psukim, Hakhel, to gather the Yidden, which is also written in the singular form. It would have to be an individual that has the ability, the power to gather the people. He's just the melech. The one person who can do this is the king. So obviously if it says tikra, lashon yachid, tikra in the singular form, it's talking about a king. So therefore we know that ha-melech ha-yakeira. So that's how Rashi knows that it's the king that would read. And Rashi saying, who is tikra? The king. Un beis, es ha-toira azois, the pasuk says this Torah, meant, and Rashi here is quoting a pasuk from the beginning of Chumash Dvarim, es ha-toira azois leimor, Hashem Elokeinu. These are two psukim in the beginning of Dvarim. Be'ever Yarden Beretz Moav, Hoyel Moshe Be'er Es HaTorah Hazois Leimer, Hashem Elokeinu Diber Eleinu B'chayrev, etc. So Es HaTorah Hazois, it doesn't mean literally this Torah. It means from the psukim that say the words of HaTorah Hazois, which is at the beginning of Dvarim. And therefore Rashi says Metchilas Eila Dvarim, because that's the taich, according to Rashi, of these words in the pasuk. So when it says Tikra Satayra Azois, Tikra means the king, and Satayra Azois means from the beginning of Chumash Dvarim, and therefore this part of Rashi is understood to us. Aber der Hemshech von Rashi, al bimo shalei shoyoisen ba'azara, but the continuation of Rashi, that it was on a wooden platform that was made in the Azara, dinim haben lecheire kin sharchas nitzum pirushim pasuk. These dinim seem to have no connection, no direct connection to the understanding of the pasuk. And therefore the question is, why does Rashi bring in these details in the Rashi if they seemingly have no connection to the pasuk? In Sif Beis, the Rabbi is going to address the Kedeisim Masechta Seita. The Rabbi is going to suggest that maybe Rashi is just trying to give us a way of a glimpse into understanding the Hakhel event, what took place, what was going on, and the Rebbe is going to refute that suggestion for a number of reasons. Maybe we can say that in this case Rashi is notifying us how we could find out what took place at this Hakhel event. Since this only took place during the time that the Beis Mikdash was standing, and the 5-year-old student of Chumash doesn't know, it wasn't there, he doesn't know what took place. And even when the Beis Mikdash was standing, it also was only once in 7 years. It wasn't a common event. So it's not something that was spoken about a lot. So the student might wonder what actually took place. The Rashi says, as it is written in Masechta Seita, as the Pratim from Mitzvahs Hakhel, was Rashi sagt nicht, that those details that Rashi does not mention, Zayin and Da, they do exist. And if you want to learn about them, you can learn in Masechta Seita. So Rashi is basically saying, I'll give you some details, but there are many more details that are very, very beautiful, and you may want to know them. Go look at Masechta Seita. The Pirush is aber nicht ausgehalten, but this Pirush is not a very, very strong explanation. Weil Aleph Kiyum Mitzvahs Hakhel ist a Sach einfacher wie a Sach andere Mitzvahs. Was eine getan geworden in Beis HaMikdash. The fulfillment of the mitzvah of Hakhel is much simpler, much more basic than some of the other mitzvahs that took place in the Beis HaMikdash. For example, the mitzvah of bringing karbonis that had many, many details. There was many different kinds of karbonis and what has to be done, what was burnt on the mizbeach, etc., etc. There's a very complex halachas. We don't find anywhere that Rashi should say, if you want to know what took place, look and listen to this Gemara. That's not Rashi's job, and Rashi doesn't do that. If Rashi was just here to tell us that there's more details to look at Masechta Seita, that's sort of out of Rashi's purview. Base, loydem. If that, another question, another reason why this can't be what Rashi is trying to accomplish here, because if that was the case, Rashi should have sufficed and stopped at these words as it is written in the Masechta Seita. Why does Rashi bring the details that it was in the Azara that was on a wooden platform? If Rashi is trying to tell us that there's more details, go look at Masechta Seitas and say, go look at Masechta Seita, and that's it. Why does Rashi have to tell us more details? Gimel. Thirdly, Rashi should have written these words either in the very beginning, to say, in Masechta Seita it says that the king would read, etc., etc., or at the very end of the Pirush, even if Rashi for some reason is including the fact that it was a bima shaleitz, it was a wooden platform, etc., Rashi could have then, at the end, said, and for more details, look at Masechta Seita. Nita Reinstein does be'emtza, but not as Rashi does, to put it in the middle of Rashi. But from Pashtos Lashon Rashi is mashma, from the way Rashi structures it, it seems to imply, as the tziyun to Masechta Seita, but tzitzich nor aftos gezokte fardem, hamelach hayoker mitchilas eila advarim, that the reference to Masechta Seita is referring to that which was said earlier, that the king would read from the Chumash of Dvarim, aber nicht so divided the Gepratim, chotz nishte nech Masechta Seita. The way Rashi structures it, he says, the king would read from Dvarim, as it says in Masechta Seita, it was on a wooden platform. The fact that Rashi puts it in the middle seems to imply that the Kedisa Masechta Seita is referring specifically to the first part of Rashi, even though the second part of Rashi is also written in Masechta Seita. So if Rashi was just here to tell us that we should look in Masechta Seita to understand the whole process of the Hakhel event, then Rashi should have put these words at the very end or at the very beginning of the Rashi. So therefore, we still have our question, why Rashi brings the second part of the fact that it was a bima shaleitz, a wooden platform in the Azara. We also don't understand why Rashi brings Kedisa Masechta Seita, and why within that itself, why after he says Kedisa Masechta Seita, he brings the fact that it was a bima shaleitz, etc., etc. And if he's going to tell us to look at Masechta Seita, why does he place it in the middle of the Rashi and not in the beginning or the end? In Sif Gimel, we're going to go back to the first half of Rashi. We're going to say that even though we explained in Sif Aleph that we understand that first part, and the Rabbi here is going to actually elaborate on that explanation, there are still some details that remain not understood. Gimel. Even in the beginning of Rashi, which we said previously that it's understood to us, there's still more to understand. First, let's understand what we do understand, and then we'll go to what we don't understand. The fact that the king would read, that we understand. We can understand how Rashi deduces this from Sudish Mikra Canal, as we mentioned earlier, from the word Tikra Lashon Yachid, or as the Mefarshim explain this more elaborately. In the Frier, the Pasuk says Vayitzav Moshe Oisam. Earlier it says Moshe commanded them, Lashon Rabbim, in the plural form. And in this pasuk it says you should read the Torah in the singular form. Therefore we must conclude as that Moshe at this point turned to one unique individual. And since earlier psukim, it also mentions that Moshe, not only Moshe was speaking to them, but Moshe called out to Yehoshua, is mistaber as er das gesagt to Yehoshua. So it makes a lot of sense to say that who was this unique individual to whom Moshe turned? It was Yehoshua. Was is given Rashi sagt mit zwei psukim fardem daber ledor. As Rashi says, Yeshua at that time was the spokesperson for the generation. Amelech, he was the king, the leader of the generation. So it makes sense that when if Moshe is turning to one person to read the Torah, he's turning to Yeshua. So that part is understood. The Amelech HaYakera is learned from Tikra Lashon Yachid. Euch der Hemshech mit Chilas Eila Advarim is moving their market. Canal. Also, the fact that he was reading from the beginning of Eila Advarim, we understand the source to that, as we mentioned previously in Sif Aleph, because it says as HaTorah Hazois, which is a reference to a pasuk in the beginning of Dvarim. Ula Haisif. And on this we can add, as Rashi Bavarint Oich, Rashi is not just telling us what was read, Rashi is clarifying something very specific. This expression, Es HaTorah Hazois, is also written 2 psukim earlier, that Moshe wrote the entire Torah and he gave it to the Kohanim Bnei Levi. Und dort meint wenn geendigt die ganze Torah, and over there it means that he concluded the entire Torah, not just Dvarim. So Rashi has to clarify, as do meint Es HaTorah Hazois, nicht die ganze Torah. Rashi has to explain that we're talking about Chumash Dvarim and not the entire Torah, because the same words were used just 2 psukim earlier, where over there it meant the entire Torah. So it's very possible that the person would make the mistake and think that also over here it means the entire Torah. Therefore, Rashi has to clarify to us that as HaTorah Hazois means Chumash Dvarim, as he understands from the words as HaTorah Hazois in the beginning of Dvarim. So these 2 details are understood. Tikra means the king, and as Torah Hazois means Dvarim. That we understand. The Shaili is Ober. However, we have 2 things that we have to understand. Aleph, number 1. If you have 2 psukim earlier, a pasuk as Torah Hazois, and it means the entire Torah. So what is Rashi's source within Psutei Shel Mikra, within the understanding of the psukim, that it means the Chumash Dvarim? In other words, we know that there's a pasuk as HaTorah Hazois in the beginning of Dvarim, but we also have as HaTorah Hazois over here, which means the entire Torah. So how does Rashi know that this is Chumash Dvarim and not the whole Torah? And you can't explain that this is why Rashi references Masechta Seita, implying that we don't know from Psutei Shel Mikra that you read Chumash Dvarim. But this is what it says in Masechta Seita. So Rashi brings it here. We can't say that. Because then the question is, we're back to square one. Because according to Psutei Shel Mikra, it's not clear. Why would I translate these words to mean Chumash Dvarim and not that it means the entire Torah as it meant just 2 psukim ago? In other words, it's okay for the Mishnah Masechta Seita to say one thing, and for Psutei Shel Mikra to say something else. We're only looking at the words of the psukim. We're not looking at the pratim of the dinim of the halachas, etc., etc. We're looking at the psukim. Where in the psukim is there an indication that as HaTorah Hazois means Chumash Dvarim and not the whole Torah? That's number 1. Something that needs to be clarified, needs to be answered. Base. Since the words the pasuk chooses is this Torah, Rashi should have used words that are consistent in his translation. He should have used words that are consistent with the words of the pasuk. If the pasuk uses the word Esat Torah, he should have said the king would read Mishnah Torah, Oder Sefer Zeh v'kayetze bazeh, or this book, Masim Tzmalosh Nakosav HaTorah Hazois. It says in the pasuk, read this Torah. So he should have said Sefer Hazeh. This Torah means this Sefer Dvarim. Nit von wann is maschil. But why does Rashi go so far away from the Lashon HaKasuv to tell us where he would begin? He's beginning from the beginning of Dvarim. So Rashi could have said he reads Chumash Dvarim, but how would he say it? Mishnah Torah or Sefer Zeh, which is more consistent with the pasuk, and you would know that you read Chumash Dvarim. Obviously, you start from the beginning. So these are the 2. These are the 2 points. And again, we can't say that Rashi chooses these words because this is what the Mishnah says and this is how it's brought in halacha. But we can't say that because, as we mentioned numerous times already in this Sikha, Rashi's role is not to inform us of the details of the dinim, of the laws of Hakhel. His role is to teach the words of the pasuk. The pasuk says HaTorah Hazois. Rashi is teaching, and he should use words that are consistent or closer to the pasuk rather than use words that are brought in halacha or in the Mishnah. So the questions that we have, although we, generally speaking, we understand the first part of Rashi, that Tikra means the king, and as Atayra Azais means Dvarim, what we don't understand is why Rashi, how Rashi Taken knows that it is Dvarim and not the whole Torah, and why Rashi uses the expression Mitchilas Eila Advarim from the beginning of the Chumash Dvarim. In Sif Daled, the Rebbe is going to give the beer, and as very often the Rebbe does in Rashi Sichos, the Rebbe is going to find one word in Rashi that seems to be superfluous. In that word lies the entire message of Rashi, and once we understand the message of Rashi, we'll understand how every detail that Rashi brings is necessary and relevant to the understanding of the psukim, and that's why Rashi brings each of these details, and the Rebbe is going to take us by the hand and walk us through this Rashi in the most beautiful, beautiful way. Sif Daled. Der Bier b'chazeh, to understand all of this, we'll understand by first prefacing a nuance in the words of Rashi. Hamelech hoya kera. The king would read. Not the king read or the king reads. The king would read. Seemingly, since Rashi is not telling us the dinim here. Rather, as we said numerous times already, he's just translating the words of the pasuk. So what Rashi could have done is just give us the translation, the explanation. Tikra, you should read, which is the words from the pasuk. Rashi could explain Hamelech, the king. The lashon Hamelech hoya, when you say the king would read, it sounds like a story. Bei weiß, als ich mit kommt nicht nur abteitschen dem Posik. Nur dem Zählen dem Din habe Peil, wie es ist vorgekommen in der Mitzvah von Hakhel. It seems to imply that Rashi is not just translating the Posik. Rather, he's telling us the Din that the king would read, and in a way of how it would take place, how it would happen. What was the process of the Mitzvah of Hakhel? So, of course, the question is, we just explained a bunch. We just mentioned numerous times that Rashi is here to tell us the translation of the pasuk, the meaning of the pasuk, and not the dinim that are not relevant to the understanding of the pasuk. So why all of a sudden does Rashi say Hamelech hoya kera, start telling us the process of how it was done that the king would read? Is the beer buzzer, and here is the beer. In order to understand this, we have to understand the flow of the psukim that are leading up to these psukim about Hakhel. The basic understanding of the psukim, the flow of the psukim in Parshas Vayelech is as follows. As Moshe erzählt, as ben Me'av es Shana Moshe is telling them, today I am 120 years old. This is Moshe's final day on this earth physically. Und sagt sie an, wie die Anhage sein Tekef lachere Moshe, wenn sie wollen lieber gehen dem Yarden. And Moshe is telling them what is going to be the mode of conduct after he passes away, after they will cross the Yarden. Und danach is Vayikra Moshe Yeshua, the Moshe calls to Yeshua. And he tells him, Chazak ve'emot, strengthen yourself. You're the one who's going to bring these people into Eretz Yisrael. And you're the one who's going to inherit the land for them. And as a follow-up to that, Moshe finishes he completes the writing of the Torah. And he gives it to the Kohanim b'nei Levi. And he gives it the Torah. And then comes the commandment, the directive. Moshe commands them, the Yidden, at the end of 7 years, when the Yidden come to see the face of Hashem, you should read the Torah for them. Tikras Torah Hazais. Hakhel, gather the people, the men, the women, the children, etc., etc. So this is the flow of the psukim. First, Moshe is on his final day. He's telling them what's going to happen after he passes away. He calls Yeshua that he's the new leader. He writes the Torah for the Kohanim, and he gives it to the Kohanim, and then he gives them the mitzvah of Hakhel. Is the pashtus der tzivoy ahem sich zu the friedike psukim. So seemingly, this commandment of Hakhel is in continuation to the previous psukim. And onzog zu hamazeh, to the Yakoyan b'nei Levi was the Torah. This commandment seems to be directed to the people, and specifically to the Kohanim, to whom he has just entrusted the Torah that he wrote. And then when he says you should read the Torah, which is said in the singular form, is Yeshua. This is a directive to Yeshua. As Mikeid Sheva Shanim Nachan Arangin Eretz Yisrael, that after 7 years, after going into Eretz Yisrael, noch misas Moshe, after the passing of Moshe. So sein Hakhel, there should be a gathering of all the Yidden. Me'edes sein Eden, and to inspire the Yidden. V'yaru es Hashem alekechem, they should fear Hashem. V'shamru lasis es kol divrei HaTorah hazeh, they should observe all of the details of the Torah. Durch Yeshua's leinen farzei HaTorah hazeh is ganz Torah, and they will be inspired by Yeshua reading to them the entire Torah. V'elcha Moshe had gegeben to HaKohen b'nei Levi, which Moshe just gave to the Kohen b'nei Levi. So there's 3 points over here that I would think, 2 of them we already know, but we really truly know that's not the pshat, but there's 1 that we don't know yet. In other words, number 1, we think, not in any specific order, but we think that Yeshua is the one who has to read it. We think that he should read the whole Torah, because it's HaTorah Hazos. But also, we think, and this is not clear in this paragraph, but it's clear from the next paragraph, we think that it's a one-time thing. When it's Mikei Sheva Shanim, at the end of 7 years, you go into Eretz Yisrael, and Yeshua should read the Torah for the Yidden and inspire them. After Sheilol Zayin Dem Pirish, in order to negate this understanding of the pasuk, Zogt Rashi HaMelech HaYokedem Etchilas Eila Advarim, Rashi says the king would read from the beginning of Eila Advarim. Was der Mitmachter klar with this Rashi is clarifying 3 points. As Aleph, das ist given azoi, wenn es ist da, das ist given azoi, wenn es ist da Melech. This took place whenever there was a king, a mitzvah l'doiris, it was a mitzvah for the generations to come. It wasn't the one-time thing 7 years after they entered into Eretz Yisrael, but rather, HaMelech HaYokedem, the king would read, always, whenever there's a king, there's Hayakeda, there is the reading of these, there's the Hakhel and the reading of these parshias. Beis der Ansag is given to Yeshua, nit als machnes is Yisrael la'aretz as melech. This commandment, this directive was to Yeshua as HaMelech HaYakeda, not because he's the one who brought them into Eretz Yisrael, but because he's the one who is their king. And Gimel, Rashi is clarifying that they read Chumash Dvarim and not the entire Torah, which Moshe gave to the Kohanim. But read only Chumash Dvarim. So Rashi, the HaMelech HaYokedem, is to emphasize that it was not a one-time thing. It was a constant thing every 7 years. As long as the Yidden had a king, there would be the mitzvah of Hakhel and the king would read. And therefore, in this first line of Rashi is clarifying 3 things. Number 1, that this was something that was done consistently whenever there was a king. Number 2, that it was Yeshua who's reading, but as a king. And number 3, not as HaTorah Hazos, the entire Torah, which he just gave to the Kohen b'nei Levi, but as HaTorah Hazos means specifically Chumash Dvarim. Now in Sif Dalet, in Sif Hey, the Rebbe is going to explain what is the proof from the psukim that we're learning in Parshas Vayelech that we're reading Chumash Dvarim and not the whole Torah. The Hakhel so sagen as man nit gelehnt die ganze Torah. The proof, the necessity to say that they were reading that they were not reading the entire Torah is self-understood. Since the purpose of the Kohen and reading these psukim, these parshias, is so they should hear, they should learn, and they should fear Hashem and observe the mitzvahs. Is doch negea di parshias v'zayin me'erir u'mezares as ozayin v'yoros Hashem alekechem v'shamar lases. What's necessary to read is those psukim or those parshias that will inspire and encourage and motivate the Yidden to fear Hashem and to observe the mitzvahs. The Rebbe sagt Rashi mitchilas eila hadvarim nish mishne teira v'kayetz b'zeh, and therefore Rashi says you're reading Chumash Dvarim, and not just that, but Rashi specifies from the beginning of eila hadvarim and doesn't just say mishne teira as we asked in Seif Gimel. The word dvarim, as we know, dvarim are diburim kashim, are harsh words. Eila hadvarim emphasizes that he's speaking words of reproach. Which Moshe spoke right before his passing to encourage and motivate the Yidden to fulfill the mitzvahs. And so therefore Moshe now commands, as the Melech bedugmas Moshe, that the king who is Moshe's successor, who's taking Moshe's place, that at the end of every 7 years in the generations to come, so should read these very same words of reproach to the Yidden. So Rashi is telling us that Moshe wants the king to encourage the Yidden, to inspire the Yidden to fear Hashem and to fulfill the mitzvahs. And therefore he says, Mitchilas Eila HaDvarim, that we're reading Chumash Dvarim, because the Chumash Dvarim, and specifically the beginning of Eila HaDvarim, which is where there are the Divrei Teichecha that Moshe spoke, that he wants the king to repeat it every 7 years to the Yidden. Men ken aber fragen, but the person's going to ask, Kama Parshas Sukkim von Eila HaDvarim, seine nit negeya be'efen yashar al kaponim, zu v'yaru as Hashem Elekechem, v'shamru lasas kol divrei HaTorah azais. Not every single parsha and not every single pasuk in Chumash Dvarim is directly connected to inspiring the Yidden to fear Hashem and to observe the mitzvahs. So, if it's all about the words of Teichecha, why would I read the whole Chumash Dvarim? I should choose certain sections. The Rebbe is Rashi Madgish. Therefore, Rashi emphasizes Mitichilas Eila HaDvarim, from the beginning of Chumash Dvarim, Ki de'isiv Mesechta Seita, as it is written in the Mesechta Seita, and it's ongeheben from Eila HaDvarim. The Melech, the king, began from the beginning of Chumash Dvarim, und danach gelehnt wie gesagt Mesechta Seita, and then he continued to read as it is specified in Mesechta Seita, wo es einen ausgerechnet welche Parshas in Eila HaDvarim the Melech hat gelehnt, where it is listed those sections, those parshas that the king read, given, and which parshas he skipped. So that's why it says Kedisim Mesechta Seita, and that's why it says it right there, and not at the beginning, not at the end, because it's referring specifically to which parshas the king would read. So that we should know that because we know from the Pshuta Shel Mikra that the parshas that he's reading are for the purpose of inspiring Yidden to fear Hashem and to observe the mitzvahs. So therefore we know that he's not going to read the whole Chumash Dvarim. How do I know which ones to read? Look at Mesechta Seita. Rashi doesn't have to specify it exactly to us here, but he has to tell us that not everything was read. And therefore he says in Mesechta Seita, it'll tell us what exactly was read. So what we still have to answer is the final line of Rashi, that the king did this, read the parshas on a wooden platform which was made in the Azara. And in Sivav, the Rebbe is going to explain how Rashi knows this and how it is relevant to the understanding of the Psukim. Because, says Sivav, is better by the Shaila. This Ben Chamesh, the person, the student of the Psukim that's learning Psukim and Rashi, and he sees this pasuk and he knows already. The king is reading every 7 years, and he's reading parshas from the Torah that are meant to inspire the Yidden and to encourage the Yidden to fear Hashem and to do Torah mitzvahs. But now he has a question. Since the purpose is that the Yidden should hear the words, and this will inspire them and motivate them, move on. It's not understood. When the Yidden entered into Eretz Yisrael, there was more than 600,000 warriors, which means more than 600,000 people between the ages of 20 and 60. Then you have all those children or adolescents that are under the age of 20, and then you have the women. So you're talking about already close to 2 million people. And certainly when you're talking about years, as years go on in Eretz Yisrael, the numbers are certainly going to grow, going to increase. How is it possible that all the Yidden to hear the words of the king? And this is not a pshat. This is not an in-depth question. It's a very basic thing. You just told the Ben Chamesh Lemikra that the whole purpose of the king reading the Torah is so he could read Divrei Teichecha to inspire and encourage the Yidden. So he's going to say, 1 second, how is everyone going to hear? There's so many people. And the fact that in other places we also find that Moshe spoke to all the Yidden, and we don't see this question being raised. Number one, in those places it doesn't say explicitly that the women and the children participated. Beise steht nicht, dass alle haben gemusst hören, alle Wörter mit Moshe Rabbeinu Basachas. That doesn't say that everyone had to hear everything directly from Moshe and everybody simultaneously. Mashenkin do, however, over here by Hakhel, Aleph was sagt Hakhel es amo anoshim v'ataf. It says explicitly that this was to include the men, the women, and the children. Based on the mitzvah is tikras atayra azeis v'gena be'ozneim. It is, you read it to their ears, they have to hear it. It has to inspire them. It has to do something for them. They have to be able to hear it. The Yeshayach has alles all kennen es. So how is it possible for so many people and everybody to be able to hear? The Rashi is compelled to add to his explanation as Geleit al Bima, that the king was standing on a high platform, a mokim gavaya, a very high space, so he could be seen by everyone. Because when you could see the person who's speaking, it helps you focus. And everyone should be able to hear. The higher he is, the more direct his voice can carry to further spaces. And if he's on a high platform, everyone could see him, everyone could hear him. And this answers the question. How did everyone hear him? Because the king was very high up, and his voice carried way beyond the space that it would carry if he was standing on the floor. Now, as soon as Rashi tells us that he was on a platform, Rashi immediately has to clarify that this was made out of wood, that was shahayu oisin bazara, which they would make in the azara. By this, Rashi dispels questions which arise based on things that we already learned in Chumash. Once you tell me that there's a bima, there's a platform in the middle of the Beis Hamikdash for the king to stand upon, or to sit upon, rather, when reading these psukim, immediately some of the things that I already learned raise questions to me that I needed Rashi to clarify for me that this was Shalaitz and Shayois Bazar. Number one, Aleph. Since it says, when are you reading this Torah? When all of the Yidden are going to come to see the countenance, the Pnei Hashem Elekecha, the face of Hashem. Is mashma doesn't give dort voice, is given Pnei Hashem Elekecha, bifnim ineveinig. So where is the panim? Where is the face of Hashem? Where is the essence of Hashem? The closer, the deeper inside you get into the Beis Hamikdash you get, the closer seemingly you are to the face of Hashem. Especially since the word panim means face, and pnim means inside. So you would imagine, where do I find the panim of Hashem? This would constitute a huge miracle that all of these people should be able to fit inside the Beis Hamikdash. And also, how would I think that I could change the layout of the Beis Hamikdash that was laid out already from the time of the Mishkan, where the Shulchan is, where the Mizbeach is, where the menorah is? How would I think that all of a sudden I could change the layout and put a bima in the middle? Zogt Rashi, and therefore I says Ba'azara. This was not in the actual Hakhel, in the actual Beis Hamikdash. It was in the Azara, in the courtyard. As we find in Chumash numerous times, the glory of Hashem revealed itself. We actually had a sikha about this, about Moshe and Aaron. I don't remember which parsha it was on, but that many times that the Yidden gathered, they gathered in the Chatzar Oyel Moed, in the courtyard of the Oyel Moed, and the Eibishter revealed himself by the entrance to the Yidden who were in the Chatzar. The Chatzar of the Mishkan parallels the Azara in the Beis Hamikdash. So that makes sense. So to say that it was in the Azara. So that answers the question where everybody was. How was the room for everyone? Because it was in the Azara, it wasn't in the Hakhel. There's another question that Rashi is clarifying. We learned about the Mishkan that the various different utensils were used on a daily basis. Obviously, this also was in the Beis Hamikdash. The things that are in the Mishkan were there for daily use. Why would I place something there that's only going to be used once in 7 years? Besides the fact that it would probably get in the way. You're trying to maneuver, run, come from the Mizbeach to the thing with the blood, with the various different things that you have to do in the Beis Hamikdash, and smack in the middle of the Azara, there's this massive bima. The Therefore, Rashi adds, number one, it was wood. They would constantly make it. Number one, it was a temporary. If it was stone or something, stone is permanent. But if it's wood, it's temporary. You could put it up, you could take it down. Es ist gemacht geworden damals in jedem Zman. It was then made specifically for the Hakhel. Yet the 7 years, every 7 years they would make a new one. It was something that was done again and again because it didn't stay there for 7 years. So to answer the question of where were they, how could they fit everyone in the Beis Hamikdash? The answer is they were in the Azara. And to answer the question, why would you put up something for 7 years? For one time in 7 years, and wouldn't it get in the way? The answer is they would put it up for the Hakhel, and then they would take it down and get rid of it. And the next time they would build another one. And with this, you go into the Rashi, and you see how all of the details are exactly precise. Rashi says HaMelech HaYakira, to tell us, number one, that it wasn't a one-time thing, but it was every time, as long as there was a king, every 7 years they would read it. Why would they read it? In order to be be'oyer the Yidden, to fear Hashem and to do the mitzvahs. And therefore they would read from the beginning of Chumash Dvarim, which is the Divrei Teichach of Moshe Rabbeinu. But they would skip around in Chumash Dvarim, because they would only read those parts that are necessary to be be'oyer the Yidden, to inspire them to do Torah mitzvahs. And therefore, if you look at Masechta Sotah, you'll get a detailed list of what they would read. For example, I have the Mishnah here in front of me, from Eila Advarim till Shema. Then they would read Shema, which is in Vayeschanon, V'hoyim Shemaya, which is in Akev, Aser to Aser, and Kisachala Aser, which is in A, Parshas HaMelech, which is in Shoftim, the brachas and the klolis from Parshas Kisaveh, until the end of that parsha. So there it tells us exactly what was read. And if you're going to ask me, where did they stand? How did everyone hear? The answer is he was an Abi Mishaletz, so everyone could hear him from the platform. And if you're going to ask, where did everyone fit? This bima was in the Azara. And if you're going to ask, why would you build something to stand around if it's only going to use it once in 7 years? So he says it was made out of wood, it was temporary, and it was hayu oisin, it was remade every year, every 7 years, every time it was necessary. So this answers all of the questions of the Mechamis Mikra that he has on the actual psukim, and that's why Rashi puts in these details exactly as they are. All of the other details that are in the Mishnah and Masechta Sotah are already not relevant to the psukim, to the Psutei Shel Mikra, and therefore Rashi doesn't bring them down. In Sif Zayin, the Rebbe is going to bring in Yonim Mufloim al Derech Halacha. Even though Rashi is Psutei Shel Mikra, but very often, or at least on occasion, we could deduce from Rashi something that is practical, has a practical application in the area of halacha. So here we're gonna focus on a halachic ramification from this Rashi. From the incredible, beautiful things in the area of halacha that we could derive from this Rashi. In dem was the Melech leint the Parshas Mishnah Torah. The fact that the king is reading the Parshas from Chumash Dvarim, there's two ways to approach it. Number one, see this is a din in Melech. That says das ist einer von der Chiyuvei HaMelech. It's a aspect, it's a detail within the laws of king, that a king, one of his obligations of the king is that he has to read the Parshias of the Torah during Hakhel. Others are dinim mitzvahs Hakhel. It's not about it. It's not a din in king. It's a din in Hakhel. At the Parshias, that in the year of Hakhel, the Parshias have to be read by the king. Now, it doesn't change the halacha, but the question is, what is the emphasis here? Is it a part of the king, of the mitzvah of the king, or is it part of the mitzvah of Hakhel? And you have a similar discussion about the bima that was made. Is it for the honor of the king that we're building a platform upon which for him to read? Or is it the din in Hakhel that in order for the Hakhel to be done right, there needs to be a bima? Ubepashtus. He does tolu the erste shaila from wann we learned up the melech as the melech of Lena. If we go back to the first question, which with regards to the king reading the Parashas HaTorah, is it a din in melech or is it a din in Hakhel? Will be dependent on what is the source in the Torah that the king has to read. What do I mean? Rashi Pirush the Mishnah sagt. Rashi in his Pirush on the Mishnah Masechta Saita, he says like this: V'oisa kriya al yad melachi. This kriya, this reading was done by the king. Kidetanya b'sifri, as we learned in the Sifri, beparshas hamelech, on the parsha of the melech, which is the parsha of the mitzvah of appointing a king in Parshas Shoftim, where it says over there, the pasuk is va'aya keshivti al kisim emlachtoi, when the king will sit on his royal throne, v'chasav lo yasmishna haTorah hazois, and he should write this Torah. So the Sifri darshins the fact that it says as Mishnah Torah Hazois ein koyrim b'yom Hakhel elav Mishnah Torah. From this we learned that when on Hakhel, on the day of Hakhel, you read Chumash Dvarim. Das heißt, wir lernen das up von a pasuk in Parshas Hamelech. According to that Rashi on the Mishnah in Soita, the fact that the king is reading the psukim is learned from a pasuk, in the parsha where it discusses the dinim of a king. So this would mean that probably this is one of the obligations of the king, and therefore it's written in that parsha, and it's derived from that parsha. But if you're learning it from our parsha, like Rashi does in our parsha, Kenal is moving, then obviously if you're learning it from the parsha of Hakhel, then obviously it's a din in Hakhel. So if you learn it from the din in Minui Melech, then it's a din in Melech. If you're learning it from a din in Hakhel, then it's a din in Hakhel. So according to this, we could conclude as Rashi when he teaches Chumash in Parshas Vayelech, where he's going according to the simple understanding, the basic understanding of the psukim. Later he learns as the inyanim zanechiyuvim and prati dinim in mitzvahs Hakhel. He learns that these are details within the mitzvah of Hakhel. But we learned up from the pasuk in Parshas Hakhel Tikras HaTorah Hazois, which is learned from the pasuk which is said by the dinim of Hakhel to read this Torah. Both that which the fact that the king would read, which that would include the building of the bima, the platform, at the stage. Because according to the way we explained it over here, that the reason why we're building a bima is so that everyone should be able to hear. So these are all aspects, elements of the din of Hakhel. So Rashi, the Perushi al Torah, is learning that the king reading and the bima being there so everyone should be able to hear is all part of the mitzvah of Hakhel. However, in Rashi's Pirush on the Gemara, is Mefarish Pshuta Shalom Mishnah. He is over there. Rashi teaches how to understand the Mishnah. When the Mishnah ruft us on Parshas Hamelech, the Mishnah refers to it Parshas Hamelech. In the Mishnah where it says what to read, he calls it Parshas Hamelech. Und in Hemshech HaMishnah is Mudgish Kama Pa'amim Kvedesh Hamelech. And throughout the Mishnah, there's a number of times where the Mishnah emphasizes the importance of honoring the king. V'yerzakt, for example, Mishnah says, V'hu yeshiv aleha, the king is sitting on the platform, on the stage. Chazan HaKnesses neitel Sefer Torah, the attendant of the shul, of the gathering, takes the Sefer Torah and gives it to the head of the Knesses of the shul. The Rosh HaKnesses gives it to the head of the Knesses of the shul, gives it to the Sgan Kohen Gadol, to the deputy of the Kohen Gadol. The deputy of the Kohen Gadol gives it to the Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol and the Kohen Gadol gives it to the king. This is all a way to honor the king. There's an entire procession of people that pass the Torah from person to person until it's placed into the arms of the king. And then Kaira Yoshev, the fact that the king reads sitting down on a throne, on a royal seat, is another element of the honor of the king. Similarly, with regards to the building of the bima, it says in the Mishnah, we make it for him, for the king. So if you look at the Mishnah, it seems to go along with the fact that this is all part of the honor of the king. The River learned Rashi b'Shas, Kidetanya b'Sifri b'Parshas Hamelech, and there's a din in Mitzvahs Melech. Therefore, Rashi and the Gemara learns that this is a din in the mitzvah of Melech. So there's two ways of looking at it, which depend on how you learn the source in the Chumash from where we learned that the king should read these parshas. So Rashi over here very clearly explained that it's learned from Tikras HaTorah Zos, which means that Rashi B'Pshudish Shel Mikra is following the approach that this is all dinim in elements and details within the mitzvah of Hakhel. Shenkin in the Gemara it seems that Rashi is following the approach of the Mishnah that these were details within the mitzvah of the king, the honor of the king. Sivchas is Yena Shel Torah, the Hasidic dimension and the deeper dimension of this Rashi. Shengret fil mal as a Torah nitzchis, the Torah is eternal. Chach the mitzvah von Hakhel begasmes and Beis Hamikdash is yes net shayach, and even though we can't physically fulfill this mitzvah of Hakhel because there's no Beis Hamikdash, is the aberdoin aveda ruchnis in the Mishkan of Mikdash Prati versus Yisrael, but it could be observed on a spiritual level in the personal Mikdash that exists within each and every Yid. The Teichen Inyan von Hakhel, the spiritual dimension of Hakhel, by Yeder Eden, is the kibbutz for Hakhel von Allah Zanekechas and Nefesh. To gather together, to bring together all of the faculties, all of the strengths that he has in his life. When Zay Machshav Diber together with his thought, speech, and action. Reinbringen und reinstellen sie alle in the Beis Hamikdash Pnimi seinem, to bring them in and to establish them all within his Beis Hamikdash, to utilize all of his keiches and his levushim, his machshava d'remaisa, to use them all to serve Hashem. That's what it means Hakhel. Hakhel on a personal, spiritual level is to take all of the strengths and all of the abilities that the person has and bring them all together to serve Hashem with them in his personal Beis Hamikdash. Und das darf sein am Melech HaYakir. And in order to do this, you need to have the king would read. What calls out and brings down all of these strengths together into the person is through the melech, the king. What's the king? The king refers to the bittul and the Kabbalah, so the acceptance of the yoke of the kingdom of heaven that every Yid has. That's what makes him the melech. And that's how you get it done. You want to be able to gather all your keiches to serve Hashem, it has to start from bittul and Kabbalah's oil. As the Tzemach Tzedek explains with regards to a regular king, not just the king within us, as the melech is mamshech dominion from Kabbalah's oil and Yiras Hashem, so ala Eden, and the king draws down the idea of Kabbalah's oil, accepting the yoke of Hashem and fear of Hashem to every Yid. We had this in a Sikha a few weeks ago as well. So too in the person's own life, that in order to bring down all of his keiches, he needs to have bittul and Kabbalah's oil. Therefore, we say that the king reading is relevant to the Hakhel. The ability to be able to hear and learn and fear Hashem is dafkiv and eskum mitzat Kabbalah's oil. It can only happen if it comes about through Kabbalah's oil, through the acceptance of the yoke of heaven. If it comes from a place that because he enjoys it, or he derives pleasure from it, then it could become tainted by his own ego. And then it will not be able to complete the purpose of the fear Hashem. In other words, in order to do the mitzvah of the man yishmu l'man yilmudu, to gather all of my keiches and to have to revere Hashem, in order I have to have Kabbalah Soil. Because if I'm doing it for my own personal enjoyment, for my own personal motives, then I'm not going to be able to fulfill it properly. So Hamelech HaYakeda, in order to do this idea of Yaros Hashem, I need to gather all my keiches, and in order to do that, I have to have Kabbalah Soil. To them come to the Hemshech. But then there's a continuation in Rashi. As the Kabbalah Seil v'yira dav zayin ba'efen shel bima. That although it's Kabbalah Seil, although I'm displaying a reverence and I'm subduing myself to the Eibishter, at the same time there has to be a bima, there has to be a stage, a platform. If you only have awe and fear and Kabbalah's oil, it can break the person and it'll become like a doorstep. They won't be able to do this task properly. Therefore, it's take kabbalas oil and bittul, which is humility and subduing oneself, but it has to be in a manner of bima, atnua von tekef, in a mode of strength. Yizgaber kari, to become strong like a lion. Eich mitzadem ken bayim zayin de agbav isnasus if in Yitzhara, because through this he could rise up and overpower his Yitzhara, the yargiz on his Yitzhara, to make the Yitzhara angry at the Yitzhara. In other words, the person needs to have a subdued approach, but the subdued approach has to be together with inner strength and pride. When the Agbav is Nasos and dem Kabbalas El pelt, and if you can hold yourself high with this in the proper way, this can affect, as the Kriya von Amalach HaYokedas or the Herdven, that when the king calls out, when the king reads, it should be internalized. That it should have a lasting effect and a permanent impact on the person's koiches, on the person's strengths, and on his thought, speech, and action throughout the year. The Bible, however, you have to make sure, as says Darv Zayin Shel Eitz Shayosim Ba'azara, has to be made of wood, something that is done regularly in the Azara. The Tnuah for Shel Bima Agbav Isnasos, this mode of lifting oneself up. So Zayin Nar Be'ef and Are Shel Eitz, it should be like something that's wood, something that's temporary. Unutzen das Nor in Yanim Shel Kedusha Ba'azara, and only utilize it when you're engaged with holy matters, when you're in the Azara. So when he's gathering all of his keiches to serve Hashem. If he's not in the Azara, if he's not in the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash, when he's not in a lofty space of holiness and serving Hashem, this could lead to hardiness. This could lead to rising, to lifting himself up in the wrong way. So therefore, it has to be a melech hayakeda. You have to have the kabbalas oil that should gather all your keiches together. It has to be on a bima. It has to be something that, although it's kabbalas oil, although it's humility, nevertheless, it has to be with a sense of strength, with a strength of lifting oneself up, But that's only at certain times when you're in the azara, when you're engaged in holiness. When you're not engaged in holiness, lifting oneself up too high, like we discussed in last week's Sikha, with regards to the Maika, with regards to the guardrail, then if you lift yourself up too high, then it could become a problem. As we stand in the days of preparation to the year of Hakhel, when the Sikha was said, it was right before the onset of a Hakhel year. Every Yid is given the strength to be able to fulfill the idea of Hakhel in his own personal Beis Hamikdash. And through that we merit to fulfill the mitzvah of Hakhel in a literal sense. In the Beis Hamikdash, in the third Beis Hamikdash. In the Kriya Batei of Melech HaMashiach. And we will merit to hear the reading of the Torah from Melech HaMashiach in this upcoming Hakhel year. May it be a wonderful year upon us and upon all Yidden, wherever they may be. And let us hope that now that we are at the end of a Hakhel year, we should merit within this Hakhel year to have the Melech HaMashiach come and read to us psukim of Torah and inspire us to fear Hashem and to observe the Torah. May it be b'mehera v'yameinu mamash.